Welcome to the City of Glendale's 10th Annual Commemorative Genocide event.
Example, Turkey acknowledges that they know they've had umpteen orphanages there, run by Germany, France, Sweden, the Dutch, and hundreds of Americans that were there helping out. If Turkey knows, and they kept all the younger children as orphans so they could turn them into Muslims possibly, but the point is, nobody in the Armenian circles, in writings that I've read over my lifetime, have I seen anything about why they haven't brought it up into the Turks to say, where are all the parents of those orphans that were there by the thousands? So that the world will know that the Turks cannot deny the fact that they had so many orphans. But what happened to all the parents?
The parents? Some were raped, some mutilated, and some were murdered while clinging to their newborns. The somewhat lucky children who miraculously endured the scorching heat of the desert walked their way to orphanages, but the not-so-lucky ones were captured by the Ottoman officials and sent to Turkification centers. One of those centers was recently unveiled by Maurice Kaleshian, a Silicon Valley electrical engineer, who by conducting both primary and secondary research techniques was able to conclude that the building that is currently used by Entura Lazarite College in Lebanon was once occupied by 1,000 Armenian Genocide orphans. This orphanage was the brainchild of Ahmad Jamal Pasha, one of the architects of the Armenian Genocide.
And as I went to the archives, I found that the French leaders or the French priests, the Lazarus priests, they have written that there have been 1,200 orphans in that orphanage, and most of them were Armenians, and about 200 of them were both Turks and Kurds. And their names have been changed by keeping their initials and given Muslim names. And after that, boys were circumcised and completely taught Turkish and Ottoman culture to make them forget their identity.
Jamal Pasha appoints Halide Edip, a prominent feminist in Turkey, as the directress of the orphanage.
Halide Edip narrates in her autobiography, printed in 1926, that sometimes in the middle of the meals, when the children seems happiest, one of the little ones would suddenly begin to cry. It was a screaming, cutting cry which lasted for hours, no doubt caused by some association with their home. Also that one felt that these children, whatever happened, would carry something crippled, something mutilated in them.
In March of 2010, The Independent publishes an article signed by the award-winning British journalist Robert Fisk under the title of Living Proof of the Armenian Genocide. There, Mr. Fisk explains Mr. Kaleshian's findings in detail, how Mr. Kaleshian was able to trace a photo in a rare book called Lions of Marash, written by Near East relief volunteer Stanley Kerr. That photo was traced back to the Entura College in Lebanon. Here, Mr. Kaleshian is standing where once stood Jamal Pasha, surrounded by Halide Edip and his entourage. Old archives in the library of Entura College, including photos, handwritten documents, and memorabilia, prompted Mr. Kaleshian to yet another discovery. the memoirs of Carnegie Panian, one of the Antura orphans. Carnegie Panian, who was given the number 551 as his identity in the orphanage, was 6 years old when he arrived at Antura in 1916. In his memoirs he writes, "At every sunset, in the presence of over 1,000 orphans, when the Turkish flag was lowered, 'Long live General Pasha' was recited. That was the first part of the ceremony.
And after that, the messy children would have to be punished of what they have done. So kids of 3, 4, 5 years old, they've been punished in falakha. Falakha it was the known Ottoman way of punishing by hitting children or adults under the soles of their feet.
Ամիջապես երկու զինվոր փոքրիկ կբարգեցնեին քեդինը, ոտքերը գտնեին ֆալախայի կորզիկի մեջ, կորզիկին երկու ծայրերեն բռնած կփարսացնեին։ Ֆերզի բեյ 25 հարվածներ կդեղացաներ աներևակայելի անկտությամբ։ Փոքրիկը գքալարվեր, գջջար, մամա, մամա, մայրերնին մերած, մայրերնին օգնության գանչելով մարած վիճակի մեջ հիվանդանոց կդարվեին։
Out of the 1,000 Armenian children at Antura orphanage, 456 survived. Hundreds of them died due to the deplorable conditions of the orphanage. The remains of over 300 orphans were discovered in 1993 when the Lazarite fathers dug the foundations for new classrooms. What was left of the remains were moved respectfully to the little cemetery where the college's priests lie buried and put in a single deep mass grave.
Please welcome Glendale Councilman and Genocide Commemoration Committee Chair, Mr. Ara Najarian.
Christos Haryav Imerelots. Good evening and welcome to the City of Glendale's 10th annual commemoration event for the Armenian Genocide. I'm so glad to see so many of you here today. We got a great program, something that I'm sure will move each and every one of you. But we're also honored by having very dignified guests here, most in the front row. Some of you have seen them coming and going. And I'd like to introduce them before we start with our program. We have our mayor of the City of Glendale, Ms. Laura Friedman. Accompanied by her husband, Guillaume Lemoine. We have Councilman Frank Quintero and his wife, Janie. Councilman David Weaver. Our newest council member, but a familiar face to many of you, Councilman Rafi Manoukian. We have our city manager, Jim Starbird. Artie Kasakian, our city clerk. our Assistant City Manager, Yasmin Beers, and of course our former mayor, multi-year former mayor, Larry Zarian. Our most excellent congressman who represents us in Washington, Adam Schiff. We have our Assembly member, Mike Gatto. Representing Senator Carol Liu, Talin Mangioglu. Representing Supervisor Mike Antonovich, Rita Hajimanukian. The Deputy Armenian Consulate, Mesrob Shaboyan. We have clergy representing His Eminence Archbishop Hovnan Derderian. We have both our fire chief and our police chief, Ron DePampa, and Harold Scoggins. We have clergy from St. Mary's Church representing His Eminence Archbishop Musher Marderosian. From the Catholic Church, we have the Very Reverend Krikor Shahinian. From the Evangelical Church, we have the Very Reverend Joe Matosian. And I'm very happy to welcome here this evening Rabbi Schechter from the Temple Sinai in Glendale, representing the Jewish community. We have GUSD board member Nairi Nahabetian and GUSD board member Christine Walters. Ladies and gentlemen, although this is Glendale's 10th anniversary celebrating the Armenian Genocide, commemorating the Armenian Genocide, the genocide began 96 years ago on April 24th, 1915. On that day, all the Armenian religious leaders, civic leaders, businessmen, and politicians were rounded up and immediately shot. The Turks believed that with the Armenian leaders out of the way, the rest of the extermination of the Armenian population would go easier. And in a sense, they were correct. The planned extermination was carried out in every city and village in Turkey, and there was little resistance. Those who weren't killed on the spot, mainly the women and the children, were marched into the Syrian deserts to die of starvation. We know that to this day the Turks have denied the genocide over and over again. But each year, the Armenian community holds their collective breath and awaits a press release from the White House, hoping that this will be the year that the President recognizes the crimes committed upon the Armenian community as genocide. Year after year, we wait. Election after election, the presidential candidates make their promises, false promises, that they will officially recognize the Armenian genocide. And again, this year, Armenians across the globe and here in Glendale are incredibly disappointed. This year, the press release from the White House does not mention genocide, and it's even more insulting this year by talking about a contested history. What? Contested history? This year's press release and statement by the President is the biggest slap in the face of the Armenian community ever. And in a way, I blame myself. Yes, I blame myself. You see, I was at Occidental College in the early 80s. I was also a member of the Armenian Students Club that commemorated the genocide each year. We'd set up a little table, paint a few homemade posters, pass out some flyers to try and remind the students about the Armenian Genocide. And I can't help but think that if we had been a little more active, a little more visible, a little more vocal, we may have made a lasting impression on one of my classmates, Barry Obama. He calls himself Barack Obama now. He believed in causes. He certainly did. His causes that were important to him were ending apartheid, seeking freedom for Nelson Mandela, solving the famine in Africa. Lucky for him, all those problems have been solved. Of course, no one ever thought that Barry would be the President of the United States. But maybe, just maybe, if I had reached out and taught him the facts of the genocide and extended to him the pain of the genocide, things might be different today with the U.S. and the world. The U.S. would honor truth and justice, and they would honor the souls of the 1.5 million Armenians who died, my great-grandparents, your great-grandparents, and he would call it genocide. Well, back to the Turks, who obviously believe that if they continue to deny, the Armenians will tire of the struggle for truth, or our younger generation would forget all about the genocide. Well, nothing could be farther from the truth. Worldwide, nation after nation is joining the chorus of voices denouncing the Ottoman Turks and commemorating the Armenian Genocide. This year, Argentina joins the group of nations with ethics and moral conscience. The new generation, our youth, have been reinvigorated in pursuing the cause of truth and justice. Yesterday and Saturday, our young people held candlelight prayer vigils and marched through the streets of Hollywood, demanding justice and genocide recognition. Bravo to them. Here's the question. What does the Armenian community want? Simple. Just three things. Number one, admission by the current Republic of Turkey that the murder of 1.5 million Armenians by the Ottoman Empire in 1915 was the Armenian Genocide. Two, that the wealth and land taken from the Armenians during the genocide be returned to them. And third, that Turkey abide by the terms and conditions that it agreed to and signed in August of 1920 in the Treaty of Sèvres. Մինչև այդ, չիգա ներում, չիգա մոռացում. Until then, we will not forgive and we will not forget. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I am so happy to invite to the podium my colleague, my new mayor, Mayor Laura Friedman.
Good evening. Welcome to this most somber event, which closes Glendale's Week of Remembrance. I am proud to see so many different cultures and different faiths gathered in one place to honor the memories of those who lost their lives in the Armenian Genocide. It's sometimes said that regardless of where you come from, once you settle in Glendale, you're a Glendalian. I believe that on this special day, the sentiment is reversed. Tonight, everyone in Glendale is an Armenian. Tonight, we are all Armenian because we stand in solidarity with the Armenian community as they remember one of the most vicious and tragic events committed in the 20th century, less than 100 years ago. Unfortunately, history and governments, including our own, have declined to place an emphasis on this atrocity, and that makes our recognition of it all the more important. In fact, as you heard, just this week, President Obama refused to use the word genocide in his speech about the horrific murders that began in 1915. As an American and as a Glendalian, I am ashamed that my country, a land which was founded on justice and truth, has yet to officially call the mass murder of Armenians at the hands of the Ottoman Empire by the only label that truly describes that atrocity, a genocide. But why all this focus on an event that is almost 100 years old? Do we remember out of anger? Do we remember out of sadness? Mostly, I believe that this horrific event is remembered out of love for the 1.5 million lives lost, out of love for those who survived despite starvation and displacement. But mostly today we remember out of love for the future children of this world. Because unless we keep the memory of the genocide alive, unless the world remembers, acknowledges, and condemns each and every act of savagery committed against mankind, genocides will continue to occur around the globe. For a compelling reason to remember the Armenian Genocide, we need look no further than the words of Adolf Hitler, the butcher who murdered millions, including an entire branch of my family. In 1939, as validation for his own massacres, Hitler wrote, "Who, after all, speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians?" It is the duty of the entire civilized world to answer Hitler. We speak for the Armenians. There can be no justice for the victim of any genocide until there is the acknowledgement of the victims of all genocides. There are still those who deny the historical reality of the Armenian Genocide, despite vast and overwhelming evidence to the contrary. And there are those who turn their backs on the truth to satisfy a political agenda. But politics, fleeting and elastic by nature, should never be an excuse to erase or rewrite history. For it is only by having the moral courage to recognize the tragedy of all genocides, including the murderous actions that took place in the past, that we can truly recognize and address the atrocities of today and tomorrow. Clearly, we cannot rely on the news media or on world leaders to make a better world. We have been given an important role to ensure that our children and our grandchildren grow up in a safer and more tolerant society, one without hatred or discrimination based on race, religion, gender, or nationality. This is our duty. This is all of our responsibility. As a city, we shall continue our commitment to Glendale's Week of Remembrance. The protections of peace and human rights are universal, and we must remain ever diligent in protecting those most fundamental imperatives of a civil society. As the mayor of this great city, I would like to thank all of those who made this event possible: the speakers, the performers, the leaders of the Armenian community, city staff, the staff of the Alex Theater, the sponsors, and the committee which organized this event, led by my colleague and friend, Councilmember Ara Najarian. God bless the victims of the Armenian Genocide and their descendants, who continue to bear the responsibility of making sure that history will not be forgotten. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Friedman. And now I'd like to invite up to the podium the #1 advocate, the #1 crusader for the Armenian Genocide Resolution and the recognition of the Armenian Genocide, our Congressman Adam Schiff.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you, Ara. It's an honor to be with you this evening, all of you, and I want to thank the Glendale Genocide Commemoration Committee for the outstanding job they've done now for a decade in recognizing the genocide and beautifully bringing together this evening's event. I participated in a commemoration back in Washington in the Capitol about 10 days ago. And there was a woman who has come every year. She was if not one of the children that was on the screen here tonight, she was one of the other hundreds of thousands of children during the genocide. She survived. She was marched through the desert. She is now in excess of 100 years old. And she comes every year and waits patiently for the administration and the Congress to do its moral duty, to speak truth about genocide. She's been waiting a very long time. There is no excuse on earth to justify the failure of our government to do what it should do. Ara, you're too kind, too generous to the administration to try to take responsibility for our president's failure to recognize the genocide. I wish I could say that the president didn't understand what took place or had some question about history, but that's not the case. The president knows very well that the Armenian Genocide was the first genocide of the last century. There's no question about that. And the Congress knows it too. What is lacking in the White House and in the Congress is not knowledge or understanding, it is courage. It is the will to speak. It is the will to accept the consequences of speaking truth to power, of alienating friends and allies when it's necessary anywhere in the world on a subject of the enormity of genocide. That is what is lacking. I like Mayor Friedman's suggestion. It reminded me of the courage of another president who, back in the Berlin airlift days, went to Berlin and had the courage to say, "Ich bin ein Berliner," I am a Berliner, and expressing solidarity with what the people of Berlin were going through when they were isolated and blockaded, much as Armenia is today. And I look forward to the day when the White House, when the President of the United States will say, "Yes, I am," on April 24th. Yes, I am. On April 24th, we are all Armenians, as Mayor Friedman so eloquently put it. This woman who attends every year was a child like these children we saw. She was marched in the desert not because she was a rebel, not because she was part of some fifth column, not because she was bearing arms, as if a child could bear arms at that age. She was marched in the desert for a very simple reason. She was Armenian. And that is the very definition of genocide. Thank you, and God bless.
Thank you, Al. Thank you, Congressman. Let's now please welcome Assemblymember Michael Gatto, representing us, the 43rd Assembly District in Sacramento.
Yes, Mike Gatonem, and it is my distinct honor to represent Glendale in the California State Assembly, which has the largest population of Armenian Americans in the United States. The Armenian American community in Glendale has welcomed me. They have taken me into their hearts, into their homes, and I've been deeply touched by the reception that I have received. Tonight, this community comes together to commemorate the Armenian Genocide, which was an unimaginably tragic time in its history and in the history of all humankind. This year, however, as many people obviously know, the commemoration day, April 24th, was Easter Sunday, and it's on that theme of rebirth that I wish to dwell. Because despite the efforts of the Ottoman Turks, despite the efforts to literally wipe a people off the face of the planet, I look around today, I look around tonight, and I see a successful, hardworking, values-oriented people, the sons and daughters of the diaspora, who are stronger today than ever before. In In my short time in the Assembly, I've been hard at work fighting for justice for the genocide survivors and for their descendants. And I'm happy to report that I've already gotten one small victory. So just last week, the California State Assembly passed my bill, which would allow the descendants of genocide survivors to file suit in California courts through 2016. That is a very important date because, as all of you know, in 2015 will mark the 100th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide. And it is my hope that the attention paid to that tremendous milestone will bring more attention to what the survivors have gone through and what the descendants of the survivors have gone through. It would be the ultimate injustice to deny the descendants of genocide survivors access to our court system. 2 days ago, I got sworn in for the California Genocide Memorial Commission. This is a commission that will create a genocide monument, a monument to all genocides in the city of Sacramento that is designed to be a worldwide destination for people who want to learn about man's inhumanity to man. It is going to have displays and markers on all of the major genocides in the 20th century and in centuries previous. This commission is going to be a worldwide destination for people who want to learn about these matters. And as long as I am on that commission, we are going to make sure that the state of California bears witness to the Armenian Genocide and to the suffering that happened in the years of the Armenian Genocide. As long as I am in the Assembly, as long as I serve on that commission, the state of California is going to take its role very seriously. We are a government. We are the largest state in the Union and one of the largest governments in the world. We're the 8th largest economy in the world, and we are doing our best to make sure that we mark the Armenian Genocide every year and do everything possible to educate the citizens of this state through textbooks, through public hearings of what everybody went through, and make sure that it never happens again. Tonight, I hope you join me in saying, never again, never forget, never accept denial, never stop seeking justice, and never stop being proud of what this community has become. Thank you.
Thank you, Assembly Member. And now we have a theatrical performance by members of the Armenian Dramatic Arts Alliance, Christine Kalujian and Sean Duke Musekian, performing Forgotten Bread.
We grew up together.
She and I.
At opposite ends of the village.
Born 1 month apart, 1 month after the first century.
Oh, they celebrated our births all day and all night. We were the blessings for the village. The new generation.
Even though our families were very, very different, we were raised together.
We were wealthy, jewelers, goldsmiths, 12 children total. I was lost somewhere in the middle of that. We had a house with 2 floors, a garden, and a little swimming pool.
And we survived very well. We raised goats, we raised sheep, we tended to silkworms.
But no one was less or more than the other. Never.
No, our village never thought like that. What was ours was theirs. We shared and we loved.
But how surprised our families were when they discovered that we loved each other not as brother and sister. I was 11.
I was clueless.
It was a schoolgirl crush. I used to pinch him.
I thought she was mean, you know. Then at 13,
I started to ignore him.
She knew that. It drove me crazy. She knew it and she loved it.
I made him wait.
Then at 14?
Oh, God, 14.
She would sneak out at night, especially if the moon was full.
In my family, who would notice?
She would visit me in the barn after my work was done. I smelled like animals. I smelled like hay.
I didn't care. He could have smelled like Death and I still would have begged to hold him.
We spent hours together.
Ugh, but not like that. We respected each other.
She made me wait.
We talked of life, of nature, of the future.
Of running away from our little village stuck by the Tigris between a river and a mountain, you know.
We made promises to each other.
Marry at 17.
To have our first child at 18.
And another soon after.
Oh, not too soon.
Our own place in the mountains, nothing in between.
Oh, God, how we laughed, hours spent feeling his lashes on my cheek.
I used to run my fingers through her hair, clearing the tangles.
I never had tangles.
She put them there on purpose. I know that she did. Come on.
And then that summer,
It was late summer.
they came for us.
They came for everybody.
They gave us 3 days, no more, no less.
3 days to pack up generations of lives.
And on the morning of the third, they gathered all the men, tied them together, and marched them from the town. They were to be taken ahead for safety, to make the march easier. I could not let go of my father.
I had to pry her fingers from his neck before the soldiers beat her. I barely had time to kiss my father goodbye before they were all dragged away. An hour later, they put the rest of us in a line. We heard the guns, and we knew.
My mother took dirt and rubbed it all over my face, my hands, my legs, and she dressed me in rags and made me walk with my back hunched over. This way the soldiers might not try to rape me.
I was 14, so my beard hadn't come in yet. So my mother dressed me in my sister's clothes. She knew it was just a matter of time before the soldiers would return for the rest of the men and the boys and the children and the babies.
And then we walked.
My God, how we walked. 1 month, 2 months, always heading south, together. One day, my mother just got tired. She stopped. She said, go on. God will look after me. God will look after me. He'll take care of you. I wouldn't leave her side until she finally just slapped me. And she pushed me away.
My mother died from grief, her heart broken and missing my father. She walked away one night to try and find some food, but she never came back, and we were left alone.
Brothers and sisters, the two of us holding hands, trying to find some kind of security, you know? No time to grieve, just time to survive.
And then they came for me, for many of us. Early in the morning, they came, they waved their soldiers at us, their guns, and they took many of the young girls.
They took her. I held on to her leg until the rifle came down into my face. When I finally came to, my brother was rubbing my hand. He was saying, please, wake up. I woke up. I panicked. I started running, looking for her everywhere. I couldn't find her. Finally, when my legs would no longer move, I turned around. I couldn't find the line. I called out my brother's name day and night, but I was left alone on the road. Yeah. So I did what I could to survive. I found other boys, orphan boys on the road. We would beg, we would steal. Sometimes an old woman would take me in, but I slept in caves, I slept in barns. Then one night, a Turkish family found me. I was so scared. But they took me in. They fed me, they bathed me. They took care of me. They called me Ahmed to fool everyone. They said I was the orphan child of an uncle. And I stayed with them for many years. They took care of me. But all the time, my thoughts were on her.
He was the only reason I survived. Our pledge kept me going through the darkest of nights. I was taken and sold to a Turkish man who needed a slave. Sorry, a wife. He had a kind face and a nice smile. I cleaned his clothes, I prepared his meals, I rubbed his feet, but I would never stay in his bed. In fact, I stayed on the floors and on mats, sometimes sharing the space with the sheep. And one night, his urges were so strong that he grabbed me from my sleep and forced, even now it's too difficult to speak about it, to remember it. I never told him this.
I suspected that something had happened.
I never told him how he forced me to marry him.
I never asked. It wasn't my place.
Of the child I had to bear, his son.
I didn't want her to feel guilt or shame.
And how when I was 20, I ran from that house. I left my child sitting in that yard playing with rocks. And I ran with nothing but the clothes on my back and my name. Mine.
I left with their blessings and their tears. My Turkish mother begged me not to go, but my Turkish father, he understood why I had to leave. They gave me some money, some clothes, some food, and their love to take with them. I was an orphan at 20, walking again, always walking, never sure of where the journey was going to end. I sold sheep, I sold goats, I tended silkworms, I built houses, I delivered packages on bicycles. Everywhere I went, I looked for her. And by the time I got to Lebanon, I had discovered the joy and the freedom of driving. I taught myself all the gears, all the pedals. I was a chauffeur for a fabric company.
I had no skills except the one to survive. I was hard enough and strong enough to make it through anything, and what kept me always walking was him, always him. By God's blessing, I ran into a missionary one day, and she took me to an orphanage, the Bird's Nest, the largest in Lebanon. She trained me to be a teacher and a nurse. I became sort of a big mother for the little children there. But in my heart, I could always feel him close. So I asked every child and every adult. I walked all of the towns talking to anyone I could, and no matter all the no's, I stayed patient and hopeful.
I took a room with a widow, and I would help her with chores whenever I wasn't working.
I shared a room with two other girls from the orphanage. Now, they both made women's undergarments for an Italian company in Beirut. And then one morning,
it was in spring,
I went with them on their delivery. Now, I had never been interested to go before, but for some reason this morning, God only knows, I said yes.
I did my usual pickups and deliveries that morning. Then I got another assignment because one of the drivers had to stay at home with his wife while she delivered their son.
So we were waiting downstairs, and I was reading a book of French poems.
I got late. I got lost.
And this beautiful, shiny car with thin wheels arrived.
I get out of the car. I'm sweating. I'm apologizing.
And I trip, and I drop my book.
One of the girls stumbled, but her book fell down to the ground. I reached down to pick it up.
I looked up to say thank you.
I knew.
It had to be. And I couldn't say anything.
There was no words. After all of these years.
Not a sound from either of us. So I said nothing. Got into the car, sat down and rode with my friends.
I started driving very slowly, distracted by her face in the mirror.
Looking at those eyes again, those beautiful lashes now grown fuller and longer.
When we got to the factory, she stayed in the back. And then she stayed with me the rest of the day, driving around with me.
How could I leave? If I couldn't speak, I would sit there until God made my mouth work.
When the day ended, I took her back to her building, and I got out of the car.
He opened the door for me, and I slowly got out.
We stood there.
And then we fell into each other.
She wept, and I wept.
6 years of yearning, of wanting, of needing, all exploding in one embrace that I wanted to never end.
And the next day, I picked her up, and she drove with me all day.
And the next the same, and on for months as we talked and shared, found our love again.
It was never lost, you know. Just put away for safekeeping.
We were married a few months later. My friends made me a beautiful white dress.
Simple ceremony for a very complicated love.
And what better celebration of our love than the child that began to grow inside me?
Every day that we celebrated our love, we erased one day of horror from our past.
Then, one day, he mentioned America.
So many of our people had escaped there. They set up communities.
So we packed what little we had, and we left.
What did we have to keep us here, huh? A few friends, but too many memories that couldn't be kept quiet at picnics or dinners. So this would be enough for the two of us.
3.
All right, the 3 of us. So the days now were endless on the boat, rocking back and forth.
Sliding up and over those waves.
Yeah.
I would have preferred crossing the deserts again, over not having solid land under our feet, right?
I couldn't stop staring at the stars, you know. I would sing her songs. I'd rub her belly. I'd run my hands through her hair.
You couldn't resist.
I wouldn't resist.
And then when we finally arrived, oh God,
geez.
all the people, the noise, the dirt.
Like a maze of people everywhere.
But we were met with nothing but kindness and charity. They had heard of our people, knew of our plight. Sympathy and kindness, this was so foreign to us.
To be respected and honored, you know? Given options to survive instead of tools of destruction. This was some kind of grace of humanity.
It's the grace of God. Yeah. But we ended in Boston. Yeah. I became a teacher for children.
I had my own shop. I was selling carpets and furniture. We had an apartment up above the shop.
Not too big, not too small, just enough for the two of us.
Did three.
Oh, 3. Yeah. Then 4.
Yeah.
And finally 5. All healthy, all happy, all together.
So, our children ask sometimes, but we don't tell them.
Well, not everything. It's enough that our dreams are disturbed every night. Why should theirs?
They need a place to start. A place to write their own history. Yeah? From something good.
And how we loved giving them every opportunity. Watching them grow and learn and love and succeed and flourish like wildflowers on a mountainside.
Wildflowers, you see? She loves her. Yeah. And we can't stop loving each other.
When he sleeps, I put my face to his and I still feel his eyelashes.
And I fall asleep with my hand in her hair.
And that is how they will find us one morning, tangled like young lovers, safe.
Saying goodbye to another century.
And maybe our stories die with us. Who knows?
Maybe it's better that way.
But always, always.
Always. The love.
The love.
And the hope.
The hope.
And 1, 2, 3.
Yeah.
Please welcome Caravan Dance performing Dile Yaman.
Ladies and gentlemen, our keynote speaker this evening is Stephen Kurkjian. Before announcing his retirement in 2007, Stephen Kurkjian had become one of the most acclaimed newspaper reporters in the country, as well as at the Boston Globe, where he worked as a reporter and editor since 1968. He was a founding member of the Globe's Spotlight team, which remains the most senior investigative reporting team among U.S. newspapers. As a member of that team, he won 3 Pulitzer Prizes in 1972, 1981, and 2003. Between 1986 and 1991, Kurkjian headed the Globe's 10-person Washington Bureau and covered the Supreme Court, the Justice Department, and the Reagan and Bush White Houses. Kurkjian's late father, Anush Avon Kurkjian, survived the Armenian Genocide, being carried to safety by his mother after Anush's father was taken from the family home in Kiji and killed. Nearly 80 years later, Kurkjian accompanied his father back to his native village and wrote about their trek in a cover story for the Boston Globe's Sunday magazine titled Roots of Sorrow. In January 2007, upon hearing of the assassination of Hrant Dink, Kurkjian flew to Istanbul and covered Dink's funeral for the Boston Globe. A few weeks later, Kurkjian returned to Turkey to research and write a 4,000-word article on Dink's life and death for the AGBU magazine. In recent years, Kurkjian has spoken at genocide commemoration events at the Massachusetts and Connecticut State Houses, as well as in Providence, Detroit, and Houston. And now he can add to that the great city of Glendale. Mr. Kurkjian.
Thank you very, very much for those warm words and for welcoming me here tonight. I'm a lifelong Celtics fan as well. I hope that doesn't hold me against me. I was honored when I got the call from Zazette to ask me to be considered coming out here to Glendale to speak at your 10th commemoration event here. And to have met the counselor, the new mayor, and the other councilors, I can only tell you, you have the good sense that you have shown in electing your political leaders. As well, for Congressman Schiff, I salute you in the work that you have done in Congress in trying to get recognition to this genocide. You all have fulfilled the goals spelled out by our grandfathers and grandmothers. By doing well, you bring honor not only to your family and home, but your community at large and the Armenian people everywhere. Boston, that city that I grew up in, is an ethnic city, and although you know we have a large Armenian community in Watertown, the Armenian presence is small compared to that of the Irish, Italians, Jews, and the Asian communities. I cannot tell you how many times in my telephone conversations that I've had as a reporter started out and they would say, Kurkjian, how do you pronounce that name? And I would tell them my mother's old motto was, think of Kirk Douglas having a glass of gin and you've got our name perfectly. Unfortunately, as the years went by, fewer people remembered Kirk Douglas. But it would invariably prompt the question, what nationality is that? And I would say, it was Armenian. And invariably they would wait a moment and they would say, an Armenian. I knew an Armenian when I was growing up. And let me tell you about them. And they would tell me about the landlord who had forgiven their family's rent for a month or two during their family's hard times. Or their grocer who would make sure that their shopping bags were filled with ample supplies of meat, vegetables, and fruit, even when their family didn't have the money to pay for it. Or for the doctor who had spent hours at their late mother's bedside giving her comfort when all others had lost hope. These are not mythical accounts. Remember the experience of Senate President Robert Dole, who has never forgotten Dr. Hampa Kilikian for performing 7 surgeries on Senator Dole's hand, deformed by shrapnel during the Second World War. They know us not by our wealth or power, but our determination and our good deeds, our humanity, which is a wonder when you think of the inhumane things that had long befallen us. First and foremost, the genocide of 1915 and the denialist politics that followed it. This being our commemoration of that event, it is natural that I speak of the effort in Congress to have our genocide recognized of what happened 96 years ago as a genocide. The willful act of the Ottoman Empire to eliminate by death or deportation the Armenians from their natural homeland in Anatolia. The Turkish government spends millions of dollars a year to make certain that the U.S. government does not do what independent scholars have recognized, the historical fact of a genocide. No government can be regarded as legitimate that does not recognize history. And no matter how difficult it is for its people to convey the truth of those events in its schools and its history books, Turkey must know we're not going to give up the cause. Deporting us from our homes, killing a generation of our men, our grandfathers, our great-grandfathers, trying to take away our history has not worked. We are a people whose heritage dates back nearly 5,000 years. Time is on our side. Justice bends towards the truth. Like my father, so many of our survivors now have passed on. But thankfully, through the diligent work of organizations like my own, the one that I am part of in Massachusetts, the National Association of Armenian Studies and Research, plus scholars as Richard Hovhannisyan, your eminent scholar at UCLA, Vahakan Dadrian, Ara Sanjan, Tana Akjam, the research continues. Through the pressure of the world community, the Turkish government finally opened up its archives to legitimate researchers, but only by a crack. Those archives remain open for only 25 documents a day to those scholars who do their work. I have traveled to Turkey on several occasions for work covering the assassination of Hrant Dink, and for my family's interest accompanying my father to his ancestral home, a small village called Kiri, high in the Taurus Mountains, in a trip arranged by Armin Aroyan, who was a resident of Southern California. I would recommend to you, each of you, to take such a trip, to return to the villages of your roots. I came away from that trip understanding what it's meant to be an Armenian. Hard work, the dependence on our shared Christian faith and families. And the older I've come, the more that experience has meant to me. I know many of you would not consider taking that trip, and I respect that decision, that you would not give any support or money to the Turkish government. But I also know what you miss by not going back. You see it on that face of wonderment that our Odat friends show when they come back from their vacations to their homelands, back from the villages and provinces that their families came from, whether Italian, Irish, Scottish, Polish, African. The reconnecting with their roots refresh and add new meaning to their lives. And invariably they say the same thing. You should have seen the people there. They look just like me and my family. And it was that sense of renewal that I felt when I went back to my father's village in eastern Turkey. I saw so many men and women who looked like my cousins. Both their faces and the still standing structures that remind us of what Armenian life was like there. From the backyards still thick with grapevines to the wide windowed, flat-roofed homes where they lived to the few churches that stand still. And I realized what has become a motto for me. Our grandparents, my grandparents, did what God expected. They survived. And now the obligation passes on to us, and you uphold that obligation. Persevere, pass on to our children and grandchildren the knowledge of our history and our heritage and the pride that comes in being Armenian. It is what we were put on this earth to do. I have been researching of late a photograph that came from one city where the genocide was particularly ferocious, Gessaria. That photograph shows the image of 55 Armenian men, the pillars of the Armenian community in Gessaria, all soon to be either hanged or put on death marches and killed. And in my research, I found that there were no Armenian funerals, no services for these martyrs. They were thrown into common graves and buried. That wrong needs to be addressed. And I would urge the Turkish government to underwrite an initiative to allow an Armenian funeral with full religious ceremonies for every person who was killed during the genocide on the soil where that death took place. Invite our priests, invite our Deadites, invite our Badvalis, and our ministers to those cities and villages where our ancestors have died. Allow them to have services there and invite us back to the soil where our roots are so deep. Allow those souls that still haunt that land to be honored as they should be honored with grace and thankfulness for being our grandparents and being our ancestors. Thank you for letting me speak to you tonight.
Please welcome the Glendale Philharmonic Orchestra, and welcome the principal conductor and artistic director, Mikhail Avetisyan. Please welcome soloist Ruben Harutyunyan. Members of the Glendale Youth Orchestra and the International School of Music Choir now join the orchestra.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending this evening, but this event could not have been put on without the great help and support of our sponsors: Mossie's Weekly, Favorite Place Restaurant, Glendale News Press, Alco Printing, the Armenian Observer, Masters Contracting Corporation, Horizon, Glendale Arts, the Tekeyan Cultural Association, Shant ARTN TV, the Glendale Phil, Robert Cower Violins, the Crescenta Valley Weekly, Noor Hayastan, Positive Motions Foundation, the Armenian Relief Society, Oasis Pastry, Aspara's Daily Newspaper, and the Armenian National Committee. For our sponsors, ladies and gentlemen. Our voice behind the stage is Mr. Jiro Habeshian, who helps us out every year in announcing and stage managing. Thank you, Jiro. And the hard work gets done by the committee, where we bring members of all the Armenian organizations together, you can imagine, and we sit down 9 months ahead of time and try and plot this out. So to our community members and committee members, Diana Acosta, Ara Aharonyan, Ellen Asaturian, Mikhail Avetisian, Alina Azizian, Bianca Bagaturian, Ruslan Buryakov, Lena Bozoyan, Peter Darakjan, Arlet Derovanesian, Viken Khachaturian, Seda Khojayan, Artin Manukyan, Barry McComb, Jill Simonian, and Nora Yakubian. Thank you, committee members. And of course, we put city staff hard to work. We've got all the crew from GTV6, Vicky Gardner, Dean Lopez, Hripsime Marashian, and of course, Zizette Mullins. Ladies and gentlemen, that will conclude our commemorative event for this year, our 10th anniversary in the city of Glendale. Please come back next year. We'll have an even better show. Thank you all for coming.